Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a media briefing about the 2025 budget and the budget process from here on in. I'm Beth Waldman with the City's Strategic Public and Employee Communications Division, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's news release and background are available on the city's media room webpage at toronto.ca/media, and our team have some copies on hand. The budget presentation from this morning is also available online at toronto.ca/council in the Budget Committee agenda, which also includes links to all of the budget notes and the 10-year capital plans. And all of the documents will be posted tonight at toronto.ca/budget. With me today are City Manager Paul Johnson and our Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer Stephen Conforti. This event is to answer any questions you might have about the budget presentation that Paul and Steve delivered this morning at Budget Committee as we launch the 2025 process. Here we'll take some general high-level questions you might have about the budget and the process, but for questions that are specific to city divisions, we ask that you attend the service area presentations during the Budget Committee meetings from Wednesday to Friday of this week, and our media team have the schedule available with them today, and you can get a copy of that. And if any of your questions can't be addressed during this event, please feel free to reach out to us at media@toronto.ca and we'll work to get you a response as soon as possible. So to ensure every reporter has an opportunity to ask their questions, we'll take one question, one follow-up. There is a microphone at the back, and we have staff that can direct you to it. It's over there. And once everyone's had an opportunity to ask questions, you can then rejoin the queue. We also ask that you introduce yourself and your media outlet so we know who you are. Let's go right to questions, and we're happy to open the floor. And I see Matt at the mic.
I don't even have to introduce myself, but it's Matt Bingley from Global News. Just wondering, when it comes to the balancing actions, you list off the number of things to deal with that opening pressure. Can you just explain, maybe in the plainest terms possible, what is a temporary bridging strategy?
Sure, I'll jump in. So in the simplest of terms, that would be us essentially drawing from a reserve, but doing it in a manner where we're not just managing the amount we're drawing this year, we're looking at the amount that we can scale down over a few years, while we then over time replace it with other actions that might be coming forward as part of the long-term financial plan or other offsets or reductions to be able to compensate for that temporary measure that we put in place over this period of time within our multi-year approach.
So when you talk about a reserve, is this like that big nest egg that people were pointing to say, like, listen, why don't you just spend on that for the entire thing? But you were, I know in previous budgets there's been concern about tapping that all out all at once. So just can you clarify how much money is in that reserve at the moment?
Yeah, so this is a reserve that we did start building up during the pandemic and have slowly been bringing it down. What we're drawing from is $330 million. The reserve itself is called the Budget Bridging and Balancing Reserve. It was created last year, where we consolidate all those funds. After this year's draw, there should still be about maybe $30 million or so left in the reserve. But again, that is part of our multi-year strategy in terms of being able to continue to draw that down in 2026.
Hi, I'm Alexander Zdravko with Taxi News. My question today is this budget considering any sort of retirement package for elderly cabbies whose plates have also lost all their value?
Yeah, the short answer is there is no funding that's included in the budget for that.
Okay. Does this budget contain funds for a centralized dispatch for accessible taxis? And if so, how much?
So in December, when that issue was brought forward, that was referred back to staff. So we'll be bringing some of that information forward in 2025. The budget implications for that would be considered at that time and would be an in-year adjustment. So at this stage, we've not had council approval to move in that direction. Council has asked, however, that come back fairly quickly, and we will do so in 2025.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi there, Matt Asabibinya, Toronto Star. Could you just break down the math for us in really simple terms, how much the 6.9% will generate in revenue for the city this year?
Sure. So this year, a 6.9% property tax increase. So 5.4 is expected to generate 251 million. And then on the city building fund, the additional 1.5, I'll have to call up the number, I think it was around 58 million or so. So we would combine the two, and that would be the total amount that we would generate. So every 1% generates 46.4. So the combined, and I apologize because I've only looked at the amount that goes into the operating off the top of my head. But 46.4 times 6.5, or sorry, 6.9 would be about 320 million in additional revenue generated.
And so we try and be really clear that there's a combined property tax increase of the 6.9, so it's clear, but it is important that we break it down into the two components, because sometimes people will say, was that entire 6.9, for instance, going towards recreation service or others? And the short answer is no. 5.4% of that is on the operating side. Those are the things like the daily services that people receive. The 1.5 specific for capital is going for that. However, when you combine it, for those that are paying property taxes, it's at 6.9%. So we appreciate you breaking it down, but then also, you know, we can combine it, as Steve says, and say that's essentially on a capital and operating budget. That's what we're generating for each year. But I do know that in talking to folks in the community, they say, well, is that entire 6.9 going towards those things like those day-to-day services? And the answer is no. That's why we talk about a 5.4% operating and the 1.5% on the capital side.
And then what was your response to residents or even members of council who are wondering about why the rate is still so high this year? Last year it was the historic 9.5 was justified as, you know, we're playing catch up after years of underinvestment. But, you know, some councillors are calling this one a self-inflicted budget. They would have liked to seen it much lower at maybe 5%, given the last 2 years it's been almost over double the rate of inflation. What is your response to that criticism?
So one of the things that we did signal last year is that we're on a multi-year pathway for that, and that does include the property taxes being part of that multi-year approach. It's also why we went to the provincial and federal government and said, you need to be on board for a multi-year approach. This can't be 1 year and you hope it all gets better in that 1 year. We understand affordability. We heard that very clearly from Torontonians, but we also understand the need not to affect service delivery. So if you look at the balance in this budget, much of this is to maintain the service levels that we see here in the city of Toronto. There are some targeted new investments in some areas that people talked about being underinvested in. And so I think we've tried to strike that balance. It is on the downward trajectory. And I understand the debate now will be, and the feedback to the mayor as she prepares her final budget for submission on February the 1st will be, what's that right rate to be at? But I think what Torontonians can, hopefully take a bit of solace in, I won't say pleasure in, but solace in, is that we are on that downward trajectory in two ways. One is the opening pressure won't be quite as significant for us in terms of the things we have to do to balance that off. And then secondly, we will be able to continue to look at property tax increases that can drop as well over time.
Hi, Sarah McMillan with CBC. Just hoping to get some more details on the reductions and offsets. Can you provide some examples of some of the specifics of those reductions?
Sure. So in total, what we've identified in this year's budget is 680 million in reductions and offsets. So they're not all reductions. When we look specifically at reductions, there's $93 million through line-by-line actions. So that's where our staff will work with our colleagues in divisions or agency budgets, and we'll look at each line item within our budget. That would be within our salaries and benefit lines, materials and supplies, services and rents, down to the commitment item, and look at the history over the last 5 years or so. what's been spent against what our expectations are in 2025. So that was done on the line-by-line side. And then there's true efficiencies, so actually reduced costs in terms of delivering services that we provide today. That's $41 million. Within that $41 million, the largest impact is renegotiating our hotel contracts that we use as part of our shelter supports. In doing that, we've been able to save about $30 million alone through some of those renegotiated contracts. There's also been a series of other actions that have happened within our different divisions. One of the ones was our technology services, where again, we looked at our system applications, we looked at the level of usage, and either eliminated, decommissioned some of the applications, or again, looked to renegotiate contracts. On fleet services side, there was retreading of tires, there was looking at underutilized vehicles. We even had some debt service savings that I mentioned in the presentation because of our higher credit rating. So those were some of the actions that actually resulted in reduced costs. Beyond that, there's what we call program and agency reviews. That's essentially when the submissions come into us across all the city divisions and agencies. Our financial staff in the city work with our counterparts in the agencies and divisions and essentially play a challenge function. We'll look at what is coming forward as a cost. We'll validate the cost. We'll look at timing assumptions. We'll look at some of the cost estimates. We'll look at it through a lens of affordability or prioritization. And within those actions, there was about $294 million. All the other actions were more revenue related. It might have been assessment growth or user fees or different actions that were of a revenue nature.
Thank you. I also have one small question about the TTC budget. I know one of the pages in the presentation, it mentioned $94 million in gross new and enhanced initiatives. I'm curious how much of the $85 million approximate increase to the TTC is captured in that new and enhanced initiatives?
Sure. Off memory, and I'll get you the exact number in a second. So between our Wheel-Trans services and our conventional services, I think there's about $15.2 million that you can capture as part of the enhancements.
Thank you.
Hi there, Alan Carter with City News. Just further to the $680 million, I know you answered some of this, but could you perhaps help us understand how that will be rolled out? Budget chief talked that it would be spread over a series of years to minimize the impact.
So the 680 that we had identified in offsets and reductions, those are offsets and reductions that are factored in the 2025 budget. So all of those were factored and strategies to bring down that opening pressure we faced of $1.2 billion. So this is no different. Last year we had identified probably around 600 million or so. It's an action we continue to have to take on an annual budget process. So we would expect to find more and do more next year. It'll be part of the messages after this budget's approved. But that 680 is fully reflected in 2025.
Hey guys, Aiden Schmandy from Toronto Today here. So, we're openly talking about New Deal, I guess, version 2 now, but we don't really have a ton of details from you guys. I'm wondering if you could provide a bit more insight on kind of exactly what you're looking for, or timelines on negotiations, because the budget does include some timing assumptions on that.
So sure, and the new deal that was signed off by the Premier and the Mayor included language about the timeframes. So in 2025, we've committed, and in the first quarter, we will land the terms of reference around that, and that's the similar process. Last time round, we had a terms of reference, and then we got down to the business of talking and negotiating to some degree and understanding each other's position. This will take much longer. So I think the message I need to leave today is that unlike the last time round where we were getting together and sitting down in October for a budget that started to be launched in January and needed that funding immediately, was a different set of circumstances. And that's why you didn't see some of these things as a fully sustainable approach, because we simply didn't have the time. So I can see through 2025 and into 2026 that we'll continue those conversations. They're going to be much more detailed, because clearly, I'm not going to get into, what's coming to the table, because we don't know that quite yet. But the reality is what is going to come to the table at the end of the day will have to be something that is more than a 2 or 3 year piece, right? If we're talking about those core areas again, transit, housing, homelessness, the increasing costs around our emergency services, we need a strategy that looks at how will that be sustained. And so another part of the conversation that will be a little bit different than perhaps the last time is we'll also have to think through how will that investment be realized? And is that through additional revenue tools or a revenue sharing that looks a bit different? So these conversations will be longer. So to come back First quarter of this year, we'll have the terms of reference in place. We then begin the conversations in earnest. This won't happen until into 2026. The funding we have in place today is there until December 31st of 2026. So really, this is a lead up to be ready for our 2027 budget. But we're both committed, and they committed in the New Deal, that this won't be that we're doing this in December of 2026, getting ready for January. We hope to be a little bit sooner on that.
And just so I have this clear, like when you're talking about a little bit more sustained funding from this round, when you say that, are we talking like maybe a 10-year time horizon, or kind of in perpetuity? Some of these issues will be kind of solved.
So, pretty clearly, we'd like some of these to be solved forever. So actually a shift in the way that we have a relationship, that would be a forever shift in that. But as I've said on previous occasions to this question, how we get there, there's many different pathways. But what we don't want to be doing is every 3 years, or I would even suggest to you every decade, that we have to sit down and figure this out again. It's time that with the provincial government in particular, because that is our relationship as a municipality, but also with the federal government on certain key items, that we find a way to support the sustained financial situation of the City of Toronto. And that is not the sustainability of everything we do from stem to stern. This is about talking about those key areas that really do impact us on a year-by-year basis. And I've reiterated them, and Steve's reiterated them many, many times. So we're going to continue to focus in on those things that are pretty unique to Toronto. Those are the things that keep us from being wholly sustainable. We would like not to do this ever again. I can tell you that other orders of government probably would not like to have this conversation regularly either. The trick will be, how do we get ourselves to a place where most of this is solved in some kind of a renewed relationship that isn't contingent on who's in power, and isn't contingent on a granting cycle that often becomes problematic for us.
Sean Jeffords, CBC News. Paul, Stephen, I don't know which one of you guys might be able to give us these details, but I'm wondering if you can tell us what the financial terms of the recent CUPE deal are for the city. We've been, as media, asking questions about it, but are pointed to this budget for that answer. What's it going to cost taxpayers?
Do you want me to? Yeah, I'll start. So we have set aside provision for the CUPE deal. We are still negotiating. We're still negotiating both with our paramedics union. We're negotiating with our Local 79 union. I can note that the provision we've set aside is adequate to be able to address the settlement. The settlement's also within our mandate. Unfortunately, because we have ongoing negotiations, we're not able to divulge the exact amount that we've set aside.
What about 416, though? There is an agreement in place there, right? It was trumpeted by the city in December, but no financial terms disclosed.
So there's an agreement with a portion of 416, and we are still negotiating with 416. So no, the entire deal did not come forward. We're still working on that, and that again is why we're not releasing those details until such time as we've concluded those negotiations with all of 416. So there was a portion there, but the negotiations continue. And because it's an overall envelope in there, we're just going to continue to do our work with 416. And once we get to an agreement, and those things tend to happen in the disclosure is a period of time after that, no different than with the TTC and what happened there and other parts of our union. So we just really want to protect all involved that are continuing to work through this agreement process.
Sorry, I'm going to impose on the good graces of my colleagues and ask one more follow-up here. When it comes to the broader envelope for collective bargaining agreements in this budget, can you give us any sense, any ballpark? I mean, the mayor was there this morning surrounded by city workers, all of whom presumably are going to get raises this year. What's that going to cost taxpayers?
The total? Yeah, sure. So it is we do have many of our collective bargaining units that are negotiating this year. We've set provisions aside in our non-program accounts across the entire city. Those provisions are in and around a $300 million impact across all of our different unions, including some of those that have already settled.
Hi, Natalie Johnson, CTV News. The mayor is touting this property tax increase as protecting the 50% of Torontonians who are renters, but in practical terms, will a residential property tax hike not just be absorbed by the landlord by being passed down to tenants?
So something we've done this year, and it's actually part of the policy work we did on our multi-residential rate, is not to get into too much technicalities here, but there's a threshold that you'd have to hit before you're able to reduce or match a multi-residential rate to that of a residential. We've deliberately kept the multi-res rate at half of the increase of the residential. The reason being is there's provincial rent guidelines that indicate how much a landlord can increase rent by. There's also triggers that would enable rent to be increased above those guidelines. We looked at our increase with consideration of those guidelines to ensure our increase in property tax rates for multi-residential properties would not trigger that guideline or that rent increase on its own above the 2.5%, which is already the provincial guideline that's in place and available to landlords.
So if a landlord was renting out a single-family home or a single condo, for example, do they fall within the multi-res rate, or they would just have a standard
No,
property
so a
tax?
multi-res rate is specific to the multi-residential property class. If somebody owns a home or owns a condo unit and is renting it out, those properties fall in the residential property class and they'd be assessed as a residential property.
So ultimately, some renters then could still be hit by the property tax increase indirectly.
Depending, there'd be a lot of factors, but
Sure.
the property tax increase on those residential properties, even if rented, would be at the 5.4 plus 1.5%.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's important to note in this budget also, it includes the incentives that were passed through the fall by council in terms of building more rental housing. And so while that's, it's all related to the property tax increases as well, or the property tax rates, but we're going to see new construction of rental units in this city, all of whom, with the incentive program that came forward in the fall, will have a level of affordability attached to them, and also that they will remain in that format as affordable units for a minimum of 40 years. And our hope is that we continue to negotiate to that 99-year threshold that we like to see within our program. So the fact of the matter is this budget, yes, there's a property tax implication, and Steve's walked through how that impacts renters differently. But the other side is it includes the investment that the City of Toronto is making in those incentives so that we can continue to build rental housing for Torontonians.
Hello, Momin Qureshi, 680 News. Not surprisingly, after the news conference this morning, there were some councillors who came out who were a bit put off by the property tax proposal, saying that they felt that it should be somewhere closer to the rate of inflation. So I wanted to ask you guys, if there was a property tax imposed at the rate of inflation this time around, what kind of impact would that have on the books, city services, the whole deal, if that's what the mayor decided to go with?
So, the short answer is it would have a significant impact. I guess the question would be, is that the combined piece that would be at a level of inflation? Because 1.5% of that, council's approved for a decade of that capital levy. If we're just talking on the operating side, 1% change is about $46 million. That has to come from somewhere, or it has to be replaced by something else. So, the only two tools we have is to look at fees and other revenue pieces to which we have the total control as the City of Toronto. We've looked at most of those, as you folks know. The second piece is that we would have to reduce services or our expenses by some level. So the math becomes, what really is it? Is the combined rate? Is it just on the operating side? And then the budget would have to be adjusted accordingly. We have no choice but to balance. So for every percentage drop, it's $46 million. It needs to be found somewhere else within the budget.
So I guess my follow-up then is it at this point, whether it's combined or just operating at the rate of inflation, is something that is pretty unrealistic for the city to look at this point, given the budget pressures and what needs to be done?
So the parameters that we looked at, yes, very difficult, because the parameters were we didn't want to see large impacts to the services that are offered today, but also wanted to see some investment in certain areas, and both of those statements would be at risk if there's a significant reduction in the amount of revenue that's coming in.
Ben Spur from the Toronto Star. The budget presentation lists 276 new positions, I believe it is, for emergency services. Could you give a breakdown of which departments are getting each of those positions?
Just give me a second. Steve's got it somewhere in the binder.
You could just give us the binder.
Don't you wish?
I can answer that question. No, Ben, you won't be getting the binder after this briefing. Let's make sure that's on the public record.
So within our emergency services, frontline paramedics, we're adding 95, frontline firefighters, 52, and frontline police uniform officers, 109.
And you talked about the efforts that the city has made to find savings and efficiencies in this budget, but the budget is going up by $1.8 billion compared to last year. What do you say to councillors or members of the public who look at that and say the city is not actually reining in spending? That's an unsustainable increase.
So the first thing is really important that 1.8 billion is put in the context of a gross increase. Because as I mentioned this morning, between 800 and 900 million of that is actually government flow through that if it didn't happen, it would have no impact on the property taxpayers. So we're talking about $570 million invested through the federal and provincial governments through the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program. So that means we wouldn't be lowering childcare fees if that wasn't coming from the government. It wouldn't mean a reduction in property taxes. Same with the increasing caseloads within the employment and social service area. So there is a huge amount of that $1.8 billion increase. And believe me, when I first saw it on paper, I kind of knew that it was going to be big. That's 10.5% increase in the overall budget. But when you break it down to what are the city services, those that we really had some control in, where those investments are going, it's 3.8%, which when you factor in a collective bargaining year, which when you factor in some of the increases in the agencies such as the Toronto Community Housing and the TTC, means that there's an awful lot of constraint that was put in there across all of the divisions of the City of Toronto. So I felt much more comfortable looking at what is the real increase in terms of our city services, then recognizing we get a whole bunch of 100% flow through from other orders of government. Some of that's great news, some of that's just a sign of the times. And then we do have these internal transfers, which again, if they weren't to occur, does not necessarily mean that there's going to be a savings for the Toronto taxpayer, nor does it mean it's runaway spending by the City of Toronto and the services that we provide. I think you're looking at a very modest increase in terms of all the pressures that are on our services, in particular in a collective bargaining year, all of those pressures at 3.8% increase. I think it's a reasonable expectation that we have for those programs.
So I think we've gone through everyone who's been at the mic once. Are there any further questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here today. Any further questions can be sent to media@toronto.ca. Public feedback sessions are going to take place Tuesday, January 21st and Wednesday, January 22nd. The city is also going to host telephone town halls on Wednesday, January 15th and Thursday, January 23rd, so we can hear from members of the public. The Budget Committee's wrap-up meeting is Friday, January 24th, followed by the special City Council meeting on Tuesday, February 11th. So thank you all for being with us today, and thanks for Steve and Paul for answering the questions. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.